Today we're going to talk about Bolivia in the context of South American social movements. So we'll kind of define what social movements are. We'll talk about the Cochabamba water protests that took place in 2000 in Bolivia. And we'll talk about what makes social movements work, why they succeed, why they fail. Bolivia is a South American country that could be categorized as an Andean country. You can see here on the map that it's a relatively large country in land area. You can also see, if you have a map of the Andes, and this map doesn't show this quite well enough, but it's an Andean country. It's a country that is right in the middle of the Andes, and the spine of the Andes runs directly through it. So it's a country that is also indigenous. It's a majority indigenous country. It is the only South American country to be majority indigenous. The only other country in all of Latin America that has a majority indigenous population is Guatemala. It is a country that is resource rich, meaning they have a lot of natural resources. And it's a place that had a successful social movement as well, and that's why we're going to focus on it today. Here's another map. There's another aspect of Bolivia that is very interesting, and that is that it's a country that has lost territory to all of its neighbors at one point or another. And you can see that it's lost territory to Peru, Brazil, Paraguay, Chile, Argentina, all these different countries at one point or another. The map on the right, you can see, has a section obviously that is Bolivia, and then to the southwest of that, the country that is in orange is Chile. And Chile represents the worst of all the land loss that Bolivia has experienced in its history. In summary, in the 2 centuries that it's been independent, Bolivia has lost about half of its original territory. So very considerable loss. And with that, it's not just land area or geopolitical control. It's also the fact that when you lose that territory, you're losing resources. Resources such as oil, rubber, guano. Guano is, for those of you who don't know, sodium nitrate or bird shit. And it was used as a fertilizer for a very long time. And those who had access to it were very wealthy at one point in time. Obviously, we've moved on in what we use as fertilizer. But the War of the Pacific with Chile, and the war that also Peru was involved in, that ended in 1884, had a kind of catastrophic result for Bolivia in that it ceded about 240 miles of its coastline. This is a good chance or opportunity to reiterate something that we've said earlier in this semester, which is that landlocked countries are amongst the poorest countries in the world. And as a reminder, a landlocked country is a country that is bordered by other countries and a country that doesn't have access to the ocean. And by that, I mean it doesn't have access to ports, and so for that reason, it can't trade, or it can't freely trade. The War of the Pacific that led to Chile controlling territory that used to be Bolivia's, we mentioned that it had really very bad results for Bolivia, and specifically, what we meant by that is that this area that was ceded to Chile in the north, it's in the Atacama Desert, and it's one of the driest areas in the world. It's 50 times drier than Death Valley. If you were to take a bus through it, and I'll show you pictures of that trip when we get to Chile, but if you were to take a bus through it, you would see very, very sparse land. And you may not think much is there, but in fact, it's a very, very mineral-rich area. And Chile, with that land, has been able to really propel their economy forward, with land really that Bolivia considers or believes belongs to it. And in the last several decades, Chile has been producing a lot of copper, produces 1/3 of the world's copper alone, and that's 5 times more copper than the next largest producer, which is China. So you can get a sense now for what Bolivia lost during this conflict. As of September 2015, the International Court of Justice at the United Nations is looking to hear this case. So Bolivia is still trying to pursue this land and would like retribution, and the two countries sort of have this frosty relationship politically because of that. here you can see a picture that came out of Reuters by the photographer David Mercado. And it's a picture essentially that is, where you see Bolivian protesters asking Chile or demanding that Chile return its access to the sea or its land that is coastal. In addition to being an Andean country and a country that has a majority indigenous population and a country that has a lot of resources, it's also a very poor country. And I've got a few different poverty indicators here that sort of shed light on how poor Bolivia is. So the first one is gross domestic product. And gross domestic product is the total sum of the goods and products that a country produces. And we rank countries. And in 2014, for example, Bolivia was 96th out of 189 countries or territories that were measured. And that number came from the World Bank. So that indicates, obviously, that there's a lot of poverty there. The Human Development Index, which is a development indicator that comes out of the United Nations, ranked Bolivia in 2014 as 113th out of 187 in terms of poverty. So gross domestic product can be somewhat misleading because it is the aggregate number of all of the money that's made in a country. And the reason that's misleading is it just gives you the sum total of what everybody makes together. It doesn't give you a sense of distribution or who's making what. It's like, I always make the analogy, if we had a classroom full of people, and if I had $1 billion and all the students in the room were completely poor, and we added up all of our money and we considered our classroom a country, we'd have a gross domestic product that wasn't bad at all. But it's hiding the fact that I would be the outlier with the $1 billion and that everybody in the classroom would be a bit more poor. So even given that number, Bolivia is 96 out of 189. So it's a very poor country. The Human Development Index, however, gives us an indication of how that money is distributed and specifically what kind of people and who has access to healthcare, education, and an income. So what we're seeing here is that Bolivia is even poorer than the gross domestic product number would indicate. It's 113 out of 187. And what that's telling us is that the average person in Bolivia, by and large, has very little access to healthcare and education, and by and large, has a very small income per capita. And we're going to turn our attention to the Washington Consensus. There are all kinds of questions about how a country can come out of poverty, what kind of strategies it can use. The Washington Consensus was a set of policy advice that was given to Latin American countries by the development institutions in the 1990s. Okay? And that would include the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And basically, that consensus was that Latin American countries were inefficient, the government was too involved in the economy, it regulated the economy too much, it owned too many public assets, and it paid too much money into social programs. And that it could become a greater region, or in the case of Bolivia, a greater country, and a more economically efficient country, if it were to have a neoliberal agenda. And neoliberalism is basically an application of economic liberalism, which is laissez-faire economics, let private business be, get the government out of regulating and owning business, and allow the market to take its own course. And it advocates fiscal discipline, deregulation, and privatization. The part that's important here in the story about Bolivia's water and the social movement that arose around the privatization of water is that we look at the idea of privatization. So the Washington Consensus and the development institutions in the 1990s basically said to Latin America, if you want to be wealthy countries, you need to deregulate and privatize your assets. And that meant that the government needed to sell what they owned to private interests. And by private interests, we're really talking about MNCs, or what are called multinational companies or corporations. The idea is that government entities are run very inefficiently. There's too much bureaucracy. There is a point there. If you imagine going into the DMV, it can be a nightmare. And the idea here is that government-run businesses are just incredibly inefficient and slow. And if they're sold off to companies, private interests, they'll become more efficient, and there's going to be more competition, and that private business interests will be more responsive to the market. So in this case, what we're talking about is multinational corporations coming in and buying public entities from the government.